Unrelated Incidents by Tom Leonard. What I think is interesting about this poem is obviously the way he addresses this issue of having an accent and how important your accent is to your culture, and the kind of prejudice that he faces because he speaks with this very thick sort of Glaswegian accent, and the sort of assumptions or stereotypes that people make because of that.
Yeah. The fact that it's the north-south divide as well, almost as if you're north of the border, anything north of the Watford Gap, that obviously not educated, therefore don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think in certain respects it kind of pairs up really well with half-caste because they both use similar techniques. They're both talking about being labelled or stereotyped. And in the same way that perhaps links to things like poems like This Room, where obviously somebody is feeling very restricted and confined, and perhaps in Presence from Violence in Pakistan, this idea of, the question, who am I and what is my identity?
Yeah. Because again, it's the whole, between the accents and the area in which you live and the association, it's almost like a split identity.
Mm-hmm.
If you live in a certain area with a distinct accent, like for example Glasgow, where Tom Leonard is based in this, and you move to London, you have to adapt very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And it's the same with the cultural identity. You wear, in Presence from in Pakistan, you wear one set of clothes to please your peers and one set of clothes to please your family.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And obviously in Unrelated Incidents, he's taking on the role of this rather sort of snooty newsreader with a BBC accent, criticising people, the scruffs, for the way that they talk.
Yeah, and the fact that they probably don't understand it, and basically because you don't speak properly. Mm-hmm. You're not educated, you can't read properly, you can't write properly, and therefore wouldn't understand the BBC News. Mm-hmm. With Unrelated Incidents, like with the language, I like the fact that he uses our dialect. It's easier to read, we can understand what he's actually driving at, and when we actually speak it, it makes it a bit easier alongside the
sort of spelling and the language and what
the phonetics, sorry, that's what I was trying to think of. The phonetic spellings as well. Mm-hmm. For example, line 14, one of you. Mm-hmm. We can hear that Glasgow ringing around.
And in line 9, the Whitney want.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And it forces you to speak like he speaks.
Yeah.
So that you then are empathising with him a little bit. There are several of the other poets that do that, aren't there?
Yeah, Half-Caste is a prime example of using the same technique. Mm-hmm. That whole become me for that short period of time. Mm-hmm. Understand where I'm coming from. I'm showing you this through language so you can experience how difficult it is to be somebody from somewhere else, or to be somebody that's maybe two things at once, and why has it got to be that way? And
we see it in Search for My Tongue as well, where she has the Gujarati section but gives us the way to pronounce it so that we can appreciate it from her point of view. I think Unrelated Incidents, it is from the newsreader's point of view or perspective, but it is addressing us directly. Yeah. And I think because he's addressing us directly, maybe he's sort of maybe the poet Tom Leonard is reminding us that we all have accents and we all have particular ways of speaking.
And that it wasn't always the BBC that was the correct form of speaking. Mm-hmm. It's purely because the law courts ended up in London that became the accepted norm. And
of course the broadcasting as well, having that sort of national kind of image to portray.
Absolutely.
And I think there are obviously some really interesting words, and the way he spells them, particularly, there's with a Z, exactly the way a lot of people say it, and use don't, really emphasising the two syllables there. Mm-hmm. But then he finishes it with belt up, which I think is quite a sharp, almost brutal way of finishing the poem.
Yeah, quite harsh, which is what we associate Glasgow with. That sort of tough, hard, docker kind of lifestyle. Mm-hmm. The belt up, it does that. It kind of sits on the mouth in that respect, isn't it? That tough.
Why else might he say it? It means shut up. So who's he telling to shut up? Do you think it's us, or do you think it's maybe ironically that sort of posh newsreader? Or
I think that's subject to your own personal interpretation. Personally, I think it's the BBC news reporter that is telling to belt up, and the fact that just because we speak differently doesn't mean to say that we're inferior as people.
And that newsreader being, the person that judges, not just obviously people on the BBC News, but the person that judges because of accent or something else about it.
Yeah, the judgmentals that think that you know, if you speak a certain way, if you look a certain way, if you live in a certain area, that establishes who you are, whereas we all know in actuality that may not be the case.
I mean, I think the structure of Unrelated Incidents is also quite interesting. I mean, it is just one long, thin stanza, and lots of people say that this perhaps reminds us of the auto cues used by newsreaders. And I wonder, you know, it's worth exploring that idea a little bit more. You've got the very short lines, which make it very snappy and brutal and punchy. But why an auto cue? I suppose it's bringing to mind this idea of somebody just like repeating what is said. It's not his words, it's almost faking away. So having this idea of the auto cue that you're reading from, you know, that's you faking it or performing it. So is he really this serious about criticising people with accents?
Or maybe it's that's entirely the point, that the whole standard English accent, the BBC News accent, the way we're portrayed, is one just big fake situation, that is not actually reality.
Yeah. I mean, there are the very short lines. We do find some repetition in this poem as well, don't we? Talked about the truth and, you know, calling us scruff, just reinforcing the sort of name calling almost.
Yeah. I also like the fact that he doesn't use an awful lot of punctuation. I think maybe there's a couple of full stops in there. Other than that, no. There's also a lack of capital letters. What is that trying to tell us?
I think it's bringing to mind spoken language, because of course in spoken language we don't have capital letters.
No.
And he's recreating this experience of spoken language in just the same way that John Agard in Half Caste doesn't use the typical conventions of written language. They're both poems to be read aloud. That's the point of them. You don't get them when you just look at them on the page.
No, the performance poems. Yeah. Yeah, I really like this poem. It's short, it's punchy, and he's not holding anything back, Tom Leonard. He's saying it as is. This is what I think, this is what I feel, so deal with it. You know, I don't talk with a BBC accent, but it doesn't mean to say I'm less of a person than you.
Not a scruff, not stupid. And I think that's really true. I mean, as a theme, as an issue, I quite like the way he just tackles it directly.
Yeah.
You know, he really comes at it, you know, straight head on. That the idea that, you know, everybody has an accent. Why are we judging people because of their accents?
Absolutely.
And I think it is quite a powerful poem in that way, but it is so direct and blunt.
He's not flowery with metaphors or similes. It's straight to the point, and he's using language to, you know, the I dialect and the accent to really hit home.
I think that's an interesting point actually, because, you know, in all of the other poems we find really rich use of language in the sense of metaphor or simile or personification, but that's not here. It's almost a very stripped down poem. So it's just the sort of spelling, just the accent, to really focus in on that core issue.
Absolutely.